Hello, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of RIKK, Institute for Gender Equality and Difference, and the GEST program at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you all to the first talk of the 2020 Spring Term Lecture Series. And this lecture series is devoted to gender and climate change. And the lectures are held in collaboration with the National Museum of Iceland. My name is Eyja Margrét Brynjarsdóttir, and I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Iceland, and I will be the moderator today. Our speaker today is Ole Martin Sandberg, and he's a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Iceland. His paper, Climate Disruption, Political Stability, and Collective Imagination, on which this lecture is based, will be published in the forthcoming issue of Radical Philosophy Review. And now, today's lecture, entitled Climate Crisis and the Logic of Masculinist Protection, draws upon Iris Marion Young's term Logic of Masculinist Protection to analyze the climate crisis and our responses to it. The lecture argues that fear of social collapse as a result of climate change, a prevalent theme in contemporary culture and popular entertainment, is misguided. Instead of fearing the collapse of social order, we should instead fear its continuation, especially with a benevolent patriarch that promises to protect us from disorder. The talk analyzes the social and political reactions in recent real disasters as examples of what we can expect more of and learn from as the climate crisis intensifies. And now I want to welcome Ole, and we will get to hear his talk.
Thank you. Yeah. End of slideshow. Nah. It's supposed to be. How do you go to the beginning of the slideshow? Let's go. So I'm supposed to stand over here by the microphones. So as Eyja said, this talk is partially based on a paper which will be coming out soon-ish. And let me first give an outline of the talk. It's going to be in five sections. The first, I'm going to summarize some of the science and climate change and the climate crisis, where we are now. I'm not going to go into details about the science of what will happen because you can find that much better elsewhere, and probably you all know it, some of it. The next part, but I'm going to talk about why it's an emergency, it's time to panic. The next I'll be talking about, it's called Visions of the Apocalypse, about how I'll argue that in popular culture right now there's a lot of fear that the world is coming to an end, and I'm sure this has something to do with all the news about climate change. Then I'll talk about affect theory. That's the theory of emotions and what they do to us. And Iris Marion Young's The Logic of Masculinist Protection. Masculinist. Next, as Eyja said, I'll give some examples of what has happened in recent years in disasters, climate change induced or otherwise, and some other examples of what has also happened. First I'll talk about some of the more terrifying examples, and then some examples that hopefully can be a little more inspiring. And the argument is that we have a choice in what kind of examples we want to build on for the future. And yeah, it's based on that paper. Climate Disruption, Political Stability, and Collective Imagination, which will be coming out in Radical Philosophy Review, which will not be about Iris Marion Young. That's something I added here. First section, the climate crisis. So, just to give a very quick summary, we have the Paris Agreement. That's the landmark political document from the UN, signed by most nations. When most nations agreed to do what they can to keep global warming below, at least below 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that is what politicians have promised us. Now, how is that going? This is from the website Climate Action Tracker, a collection of various climate organizations and scientists who collect different models, and they have some of the more optimistic models on the web. And you can see the blue line is that's the projected global warming, assuming that all these promises that politicians have made, so not the policies that are actually made, but just the promises that politicians have made, that we will do this sometime. Even with that, we are headed towards a warming of 2.8 degrees. So that is way above what we promised in the Paris Agreement. Current policies, so without all just the empty talk, puts us somewhere around 3 degrees warming. And if global emissions, CO2 emissions, continue rising despite both the policies and the promises, then of course we will have a lot higher warming, which you can see in the gray area. And you can see the gray area is very spread, is a very large margin, because it's really difficult to model exactly what will happen with the global climate. So this is assuming that the policies work, which they don't. Here you can see how CO2 emissions have been rising globally, and so what has happened after we made all these political promises? Well, in 2018, we had an all-time high of CO2 emissions, and again in 2019, it's just rising. So it doesn't matter that's not because the politicians aren't doing anything. A lot of things have happened, a lot of laws have been passed, but when something is growing exponentially, you can do something to halt that growth, but it's still growing. So what we need something much more radical if we're going to make it slow down. It's also not calculating into the model that things aren't just rising at a steady state. The global climate, climate system has a whole lot of built-in tipping points and feedbacks. So these are points at which when something happens, then something else happens. Which means that when we have heated the planet to a certain degree, then, for example, the polar ice will melt, which will, one, release a lot of gases that are hidden in the ice caps, and also will reduce the whiteness that reflects the sunlight, which will increase the temperature there. And many other things will happen, things that are simply too difficult to calculate. And some people have tried to do these calculations, like at what point does this thing happen, what temperature will that lead to, etc. And one of the reports estimate that a global warming, man-made global warming above 2 degrees can trigger other events that will lead to a global warming out of our control, which will probably stabilize at 4 to 5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels. At some point, things get out of our control and we cannot stop it anymore. It doesn't matter if we reduce our gases, our emissions. So what does that mean? Well, as in climate modeling, that's really hard to predict. As I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Joelle, she's an Australian climate scientist. She says after 3 degrees, we simply don't know what will happen. Like, it's too complicated, and it will be a disaster. Other reports, like what I'm interested in is how will this affect human society? Because of course, the one thing is weather patterns and climates. There will be heating, there will be hurricanes, there will be droughts, rising water levels, but how will human societies be affected? How will it change our politics, our political structures, etc.? There's been some reports that try to analyze that, and that is of course based on a lot of guesswork, but refugees, places that become uninhabitable, power lines being disrupted, nuclear disasters, transportation systems that don't work anymore. How is this all going to change human societies? Now, there's one report, it's from Australia, called The Third Degree. It tries to make some guesswork, but informed guesswork about what will happen, and they say that this will be an existential threat to human civilization. Meaning, which doesn't mean that humans will die out, but that human civilization as we know it, this global connected world, will collapse. And the same thing is said by a report from Sweden, Global Catastrophic Risks 2018, also says a high likelihood of human civilization coming to an end at 3 degrees Celsius. And here's a much discussed paper by Jem Bendell, who's a ecological scientist, who goes even further and says, yeah, there will be collapse, probable catastrophe, and possibly we might be facing human extinction. Maybe that's exaggerated, maybe that won't happen, but it's possible. And he argues that this is something we actually need to start thinking about. What does this mean? How should we live our lives when human society might end? So, I want you to feel inside yourself. And I'll make it even worse. So, I'm going to go ahead to not science, but popular culture right now. So in books, both by academics and by popular fiction, journalists, etc., we also have this crisis that we're living in, and this fear that people are having is very prevalent. Jared Diamond, a famous anthropologist, wrote this book called How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, which is he analyzes historical civilizational collapses and has a chapter on climate change and what will likely happen and how we can learn from earlier collapses. And this was published because of the fear that people have with climate change. Learning to Die in the Anthropocene is another reflections on the end of human civilization. Learning to Die is by 2 philosophers who take Stoic wisdom and philosophy, and also takes this advice from Jem Bendell and says we need to reflect upon what it means that we might all be going to die because of climate change. Climate Wars is written by a journalist, I believe, who analyzes how societies are likely to develop in the coming decades due to climate change, and he talks about a world of catastrophe, of collapse, of military dictatorships, of war, resource wars, etc. The collapse of Western civilization is a piece of fiction about this, with the same theme. We also have very popular right now this idea of catastrophe and apocalypse in popular TV. Like you have this TV show, The 100. I'm not going to give you a summary of what they're all about. I'll make a collected summary in a minute. The Rain, it's a Danish TV show on Netflix. The Walking Dead, probably most of you have heard of that. The Strain, it's about ostensibly about vampires. The Handmaid's Tale. Blade Runner, a movie recently. It's originally from the 80s, but a new version was made recently. And Mad Max Fury Road, the same thing, also from the 80s, but a new version was made recently. And you have this now quite old, The Day After Tomorrow, which is the only one is explicitly about climate change that happens all of a sudden. Now, what do all of these have in common is that some environmental issue, whether it's supernatural, like zombies, or if it's pollution, as in The Handmaid's Tale and Mad Max, have changed human societies, have changed the planet so that human societies had to change. And in most of them, human societies have collapsed, and it's a war of all against all. I can tell you that about probably half of these feature cannibalism. So it's literally humans are eating each other, struggling to survive, etc. This is the vision that Hollywood has and wants us to have about what happens when the political systems collapse or lose their power. Then we all start eating each other, literally. So what does that say about our culture today? And what ideology is reflected and promoted in these pieces of culture, but also of education? Do they promote constructive actions? Do they help us solve climate change? They certainly help us fear it, but what is it that they help us fear? I'm going to talk about this thing, fear. This is what in philosophy has been called affect theory, which is a topic that usually emotions in philosophy and also in politics and many other places have been like dismissed as like just something extra. Yeah, we might have arguments and we have material reasons that make us act in certain ways, like we all strive for power or money or look at what's in our interests, or we act based on rational arguments, etc. And emotions are just this byproduct, this extra thing that we have, but which is not that important. Affect theory is the opposite of that. And affect theory, even though it's quite modern, that it has come back. It actually dates back to the 17th century, and most affect theorists draw upon Spinoza, who has just one quote. He has a lot of analysis of different emotions, but one summary is that when you are assailed by an emotion, first of all, it's an emotion is not just this ephemeral thing that's like in your mind, or he's one of the early ones to argue that it's a material thing that's in your whole body, like your muscles tense, the chemicals and hormones, etc. When you're assailed by a certain emotion and your body is in this state, your body is more capable of doing certain things and less capable of doing other things. Like, imagine you're afraid of spiders. You can rationally tell yourself that the spider is harmless and then convince yourself to go and pick it up and take it outside, but even though you rationally know this, your body will be resisting it. It's hard for you to pick up that spider if you actually are afraid of spiders. Your muscles tense, you get sweaty, etc. So your capability, your power is diminished. Or the opposite, if you have a different type of emotion, a more positive one, then you get more power to do the thing that your body wants you to do. One of the more famous modern philosophers who have talked about affect a lot is Deleuze and Guattari. And I have here a quote from the translator, because they're French, Brian Masumi, who translated their work, 1,000 Plateaus, and in his foreword he summarizes what they mean by affect and says that it's different from emotion, but affect is this thing that affects your whole body. And you can hear from the word affect that it's related to power in the sense of like something affects something else. And it, again, he says this, he's basically just summarizing what they get from Spinoza, that it augments, or it's an augmentation or diminution in your body's capacity to act. So I'll say it in plain language. The emotions you have can make certain actions easier or harder, but also more or less thinkable. When you're affected by an emotion, an effect like this, there's certain things that you maybe simply can't think. They don't appear to you as options. And other things that are more likely that it's the only thing you can think of when you're in this state of mind. One of the contemporary with Spinoza, he was a little earlier, but in my view also a great theorist of affect, is Thomas Hobbes. And he's primarily known as a political philosopher, but he also deals a lot with emotions. And one of the emotions that he is particularly interested in is fear. Now, maybe not all of you know Thomas Hobbes, even though he's relatively known, in philosophy at least. So I'll just give you a very brief summary of his political philosophy, very simplified. He starts with human nature. He argues that human nature is that we're selfish, aggressive, amoral, asocial, etc. We are ruthless individuals who are fighting for our own private interests. And then he imagines a state of nature, either as a historical thing that happened before political society, or maybe it's a hypothetical. I have an argument that it's something else. I'll come back to that. But where humans are these individuals who are all fighting to survive and all fighting to steal each other's things and maybe to eat each other, etc. You have total freedom in this state of nature, but it's not a very nice state to be in. It's war of all against all, and it's really unpleasant. So at some point, somebody takes a lot of power over an area, maybe builds an army, has the better weapons, and starts to subjugate the others and tell them that you have to do what I say. And people discover that, hey, there's actually some benefits to this. This dictator, this chief, etc., makes a political society and tells people to stop fighting. You will do what I say, and that means that I will punish those who disobey the laws that I set down. For example, if I say don't kill each other or don't steal from each other, then that actually makes things better. And he says there's society, and that's when humans start to change. But deep underneath, we are, of course, still these aggressive, amoral creatures. This is what Hobbes wants us to remember, because Hobbes is really afraid that because he came from a civil war, and so he had emotions of his own, and he was afraid that England would collapse back into civil war. And he was afraid that after the civil war and political order is again established, people will come to be too comfortable. They will come to think that, oh, we can actually maybe start collaborating and start making political parties and organizations and demand more freedom, more power, etc. And they will have forgotten the lessons they learned from the Civil War. So I think that one of the main things of Thomas Hobbes' theory of the state of nature is not so much that he thinks it's a historical thing, but that it's a warning to us about what will happen if we resist the authority of the state. He he writes that it's important that the state, in order to stay in power and to keep the political stability, it needs to make sure that people still fear each other. They need to be reminded what will happen if they rebel. And so the state can provide security and stability, but not too much, because people still need to be anxious. They need to know what will happen if the political order breaks down. And so he says that it's necessary for the state to teach people what this lesson, like through schools, through education, and we might say through popular culture would be more relevant. Like here's a quote from the TV show called The Strain, also a book, where one of the characters says, "Civility is an illusion. Savagery is the default state of humanity." That is like directly almost taken from Thomas Hobbes. And this is the theme that goes again in not just all these dramatic TV shows, but also in many of the books and even the academic works on climate change. So there's a lesson here. Like, I'm going to jump now to Iris Marion Young, and I hope you can see how what she says is relevant for how Thomas Hobbes fits into this and affect theory. But I'm going to start with her analysis of patriarchy, like as in gender relations. And she then jumps to say it's also relevant for politics. She says a lot of feminist theory has focused on patriarchy as oppressive, as the oppressive, aggressive man who wants to dominate others. But there's a different side to patriarchy, where gender models. So like she's explicit that this is not necessarily biological gender, what's it called? Something that fits all, like a man is like this and a woman is like this. It's more like parts gendered meanings within a certain ideology. Like the knight who protects his woman is a different type of patriarchal man than the one who abuses, etc. And subordination of patriarchy, the role of the woman in that type of patriarchy is not, one who is oppressed and has the desire to rebel, because it's one who is protected and might look up to the man who protects her. Probably this type of relationship is more efficient than one that encourages people to rebel. But of course, it's still a subjugation. It's still patriarchy, because the one who protects is the one with the power. And a flip side of this protection is that the woman or those who are protected need to obey the rules of the one who protects them. Because in order for a protection bracket to be really efficient, you need to have order. You need to have work as one unified unit. You can't have arguing and democracy or like civil war about what we should do when there is a threat. So the other thing that this logic needs is threats. Like, it's important that there's always something threatening us, because how else can I justify that I need all the power in order to protect you? The one who claims to be in this position of power and protection has to constantly point out that there's threats out there. The world is dangerous. What will happen if I lose my power to protect you? So if I lose my power to protect you, or if you reject that power, reject that protection, there's something bad will happen to you, either from those dangerous people out there or from me. Like, the one in power will do bad things to you, because now you're part of the others. Now, this is, of course, not just about gender relations. She writes this after 9/11 and the war in Iraq is about to start. security. So she's talking about the security state, but I'm saying this can also apply to part of the fear that we're feeling about climate change. Someone needs to save us. We need an authority to help us make the decisions and protect us, either from this vague threat of climate change that we don't know how to deal with, or protect by making all the rules about now we cut down on emissions, or by protecting us from dangerous outsiders, or by protecting us from ourselves because society is going to collapse and we are all inside cannibals. So here, summary. You have a benevolent authoritarian patriarch that promises to protect us against threats. And you have subjects who are protected, but they're also subordinated and will lose their protection if they disobey. And then you have to have the outsiders or the others who are the threat we need protection against. This doesn't have to be actual real existing outsiders. It could also be all of us, the threat of the return to the state of nature. Now this is also a form of effect theory. She talks about what we can learn when politicians mobilize fear and make sure that we all fear each other. And there's something that tends to happen to us as individuals and to societies, is that democratic rights, civil rights, things like this tends to get eroded. When politicians mobilize fear, when we start being terrified, we lose democratic rights. We lose power over our own lives. This is because fear reinforces power. It tends to, you can find lots of studies on all of these claims I wrote here. It makes us more conservative. Fear makes you seek authority. It makes you cling to what you have rather than accept change. It makes you fear others who are different from you. And of course, the fear of social collapse entails the desire to preserve the social order. Now, what does that have to do with climate change? It's the opposite of what we need to solve the climate crisis. Actually, this system that we have, this political system, economic system, social system that currently exists, is what is producing the climate crisis. And it's terrifying, the climate crisis, but if this fear makes us conservative and makes us be afraid of change, makes us cling to what we know, then it's only going to reinforce the crisis, because we actually do need to change the system, and that means we have to give up some of our fear, because we have to give up our fear of each other and our fear of change. But that's hard when you're terrified of something else. You could have, I'm just mentioning this here, another reaction. Instead of fear when you have this fear of social collapse, another masculinist logic is this of individualist survival. And so Michael Mobbs is a British ecologist who has now put his house, first he built a really ecologically sustainable house in the city, and now he's putting this on sale. That's what this interview is about, because he wants to move out to the countryside and build a bunker with weapons and protect it, because he fears that with climate change, society is going to collapse and there will be hordes that are coming to take his stuff. And he doesn't believe the state can protect him. So he doesn't need protection. He can protect himself. He's an individualist. He's a survivor. I think that his decision to live alone means that he will also die alone, because I'll come back to that in the end. But what we need to survive is community, and we need other people, not individualist selfishness like this. So will civilization collapse? What is more likely? I'm going to say, let's look at what we have already seen, because climate change is not something that will happen the day after tomorrow. It's already here, and we've already seen a lot of the effects of it. A lot of weather phenomena, there has already been droughts and hurricanes, etc., caused by intensified by climate change. This will get worse, but we have seen some of how political societies have reacted to these things, and we can say these might be small versions of what we can expect more of in the future. They are, as is a fancy word, prefigurations of the future. So, after, again, I'll skip all the comments about these things. So, just showing you some of the things that have happened after recent disasters and catastrophes. So a lot of when one person's disaster, one community's or nation's disaster is an opportunity, for other people to profit. I don't know if you know of Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, but it's about how every disaster is an opportunity for someone else to make an investment. Like when one town lacks water, there's an opportunity for someone to sell water. When some societies collapse and there's civil war or people are afraid to lose their property, who will make money? Military and security forces. The global security firm Securitas is using climate change in its advertisement to investors, saying there will be more civil unrest, etc., because of climate change, so you should invest in us because we will offer people security. That is the logic of masculinist protection. Other examples, after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, what the police and what the government did was not to go in and say, what can we do to help? It was, the first thing was, how can we re-establish order? Because they saw all the water, all the catastrophe means we have lost control. We need to take back control before we can do anything else. That meant that military was sent in with orders to shoot to kill, and people were shot and killed. Not exactly a protection, but what you need first in order to establish is to establish your authority in order, so you can offer people protection. You don't protect those who are outside of your authority when you're thinking like the state. The same thing happened in Haiti after the earthquake. An earthquake is, of course, not induced by climate change, but it's a catastrophe that we can learn from how the state reacts. So the US military went in, occupied all the harbors and the airports, and prevented emergency aid from being distributed for the first several weeks, because they were afraid that the government had collapsed and therefore people had returned to the state of nature. They had returned to become savages. So first you need to establish this authority, and then people saw you have all this food that's not coming here. Then they got angry and started looting, and so the prophecy became self-fulfilling. Skip a few. After another hurricane, the state was very, even though there was an evacuation order, the state wanted to preserve order, to keep the migration controls up. You have the European border walls and the whole militarization of the European borders that stretch far into Africa and Eastern Europe. These are keeping out immigrants, not just from Africa, but from everywhere. Immigrants and refugees who are not just fleeing things induced by climate change, but there will be millions of more immigrants and refugees because of climate change. And our reaction to refugees and immigrants, we can see here, like this is, we are killing people at our borders in order to protect our own. So, and that's the logic of masculinist protection, also needs to see those outsiders as a fear, as a threat. And here you have one institution that's, even if politicians are not taking this seriously, even if Donald Trump is denying climate change, that doesn't mean the American institution is. Like the American military has published tons of reports and analyses of climate change and are very concerned. And so if the politicians don't react, the military will. And what both the military and the politicians, probably the way they will react is through the logic of the state, of the protective patriarch. It will be to strengthen borders. It will be to increase authority. So this is not the breakdown of social order. This is the intensification of it. And if that is what we have seen with recent disasters, then I think that is also what we will see more of. There will be increased authoritarianism. States will focus even more on maintaining order at any cost, even if that means destroying all civil liberties, even if that means killing people. So I don't foresee the near breakdown of society or of civilization. I see its intensification. And I think that is even more terrifying. So which of these stories do you like better? The one about the social collapse or the one about the intensification of power structures? I don't think either of them is very encouraging. But we were looking at recent examples from the past, and those stories that I told you are not the full stories. So I think I need to skip this because of time. We can look at different stories from the same disasters, because society have not broken down in these disasters. People have always come together to help each other in disasters, especially in disasters is when people tend to come together the most. You've also seen this in Iceland after earthquakes. Neighbors who never speak to each other suddenly start helping each other. So in New Orleans, after the flooding and the hurricane, a lot of institutions were formed. Common Ground and Common Ground Collective and Common Ground Health Clinic were some of the institutions that were formed to help neighbors find their loved ones, rebuild their houses, retake their communities, etc. These institutions, they were not just people who tried to survive a disaster. They built living institutions that continue to this day. They've changed their social relations. They offered free healthcare during the emergency, but they're still offering free healthcare today. They're also working on restoring the wetlands. So the crisis that they lived through have inspired them to change their communities. Occupy Sandy was another organization that came out of the hurricane in New York in 2012. They were more efficient. This was all based on volunteers, and they were more efficient than FEMA, the American Emergency Organization, and the Red Cross. They organized tens of thousands of volunteers to rebuild homes, to help people survive. And even the Department of Homeland Security said that we should learn from this decentralized structure of volunteers who help each other instead of offering charity. Mutual Aid Disaster Relief is a growing American network that has learned from these disasters and are going around to communities and towns in the US and teaching them all these skills that are necessary to survive. Things they've learned from other experiences and are helping in every crisis. This is all volunteers. This is all based on a democratic, decentralized, non-power structure. So this is also what happens in emergencies. And that's hopefully something that is a little more inspiring. If you want more stories, Rebecca Solnit, an author, wrote a whole book on how people came together in various crises after 9/11, after earthquakes, many other places, and like places that became hell, but where people came together and helped each other. And it's important for our affect, our emotions, that we study these things and that we engage in these communities, change our practices today so that we can imagine a different future, so that we grow our power to change our society so we don't fear this collapse that makes us cling to the structures that we already have. And that's why we need these stories. And we need to be engaged in our communities, because community is the most important thing if we want to survive. So this is from an interview with Erik Klinenberg, a sociologist who studied have studied, first he studied a heat wave that killed hundreds of people in Chicago, but some communities were more affected than others, and nobody could find out why. What was the difference? Because it wasn't that some were rich and some were poor, or demographics, etc. What we found was that when they interviewed people, they discovered that in some communities, some people knew their neighbors. They talked to their neighbors. They knew that there's an elderly woman in here who I need to go check up on. They knew where you can go for help because you know your neighbors. It wasn't, a neighborhood blocked by giant highways. It was a neighborhood where you can actually walk around, so you see each other. There's many things that create a social infrastructure. Since then, he studied other disasters and found that similar things, for example, in New York with after Hurricane Sandy. What you need in order to survive a catastrophe is social cohesion, community, people who care for each other. And you see how that is the opposite of this message that we're getting from the social collapse narrative that makes us fear each other. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. And I have a microphone here that I can pass around.
Thank you so much. With the emergence of big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, and the rest, how do we fit them into the social cohesion vis-a-vis the fear, all countering the protectionism of the state, the masculinities and all that, the patriarchy?
Well, social media can be used for many different things. And obviously, know examples of how it's used to spread fear and anger and resentment and divide people. That's what the Russian bots and all there's money to be made on fear too. But social media has also been used, for example, by one of the organizations I mentioned to set up apps after a hurricane in Texas and New Orleans, this area. They set up an app that helped people register where there's homes, where there's free homes where people can seek shelter. And so if you had a phone, you could quickly find out where can I get to safety. So that's also something that it can be used for. It all depends on the infrastructure of the medium itself. Just one example. It's a complicated question.
I personally believe climate change is happening, yes, but how do we get people to care? Because there's a lot of divided views on it. And some people take it seriously while others do not. So how do we get the ones who are not caring to actually think about it deeper and say yes, it's happening, and take it seriously?
Well, I wish I had the answer. I mean, it's something that's been studied a lot, and there are people who have qualified answers. I'm not sure I have one right now. Yeah, I would need to think more about that.
I understand you are a philosopher. You will probably guide us through do we collapse the capitalism in order for us to really achieve do we collapse capitalism? Because the hegemonic masculinity sits with capitalism. Then what do you do then? Do you collapse the political system, which is capitalism, in order for you to really probably get some results when it comes to climate change? Because at the current moment, you have your China and USA who are not even buying into any climate change, any policies that are there. And they are the ones that are probably producing more, CO2 more than any other countries. Then what do you do? Because in those countries, you sit with the real money that is also investing in anti-issues that they are into, probably trying to bring positive signs of climate change. What do you do then? Do you still go with the system that is not working, is destroying the environment? Then on the other side, you're compromising the human nature.
Yes, you cannot. The climate crisis will not be solved without addressing capitalism. In the beginning, I showed you the graph of, we have a lot of policies that to fight global emissions, but global emissions are still rising. That's because of capitalism. In a growing economy, capitalism requires constant profit. It requires constant consumption. That is what capitalism is, and that is not sustainable. That is not compatible with a world that's finite. But the other thing is, states too, even though they passed these laws to keep the emissions just a little bit down, are also wedded to capitalism in the sense that states also, in order to keep their power, need a constant growth. That's how they get their tax revenue. That's how they keep their militaries, etc. So we need to, take on that whole system of political domination and economic domination, which is, of course, a huge task, which is as, alienating or terrifying as, like, how do we stop climate change? Well, you dismantled the whole system as we know it. But another point of the examples from New Orleans, etc., and you could find other examples from around the world, is that you don't have to do it all at once. Like, these people are setting up communities, changing their way of life, like just a little bit at a time, and that gives that, when we do that, then we can, or when we study what they're doing, then we can see that, hey, it is possible to live a different way. It is possible to have different social relations. And that helps us hopefully start the process.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Ole. I just have one question concerning perhaps this figure or stereotype of the benevolent or good patriarch, because you put up the picture of Donald Trump, who's obviously a figure that is much sort of presented today. But if I understand Iris Marion Young right, perhaps this figure of the good patriarch is a bit more subtle than Donald Trump. It might come as somebody who would be talking for democracy, but at the same time kind of taking the power away from us. And I'm just sort of wondering about this, how this could play out in the coming decades, or if there's some examples of these more subtle power figures that are actually more reproducing the power structures than to sort of transform them into more democratical ones. Yes.
Yes, like Donald Trump is in many ways a bad example of this, because he's not subtle about it. But the reason I put up the picture of him is because he gave his opening speech when he was elected, painting this picture of a society in decay, of like almost as if America had fallen into civil war and collapse, and therefore you should, like, he will fix it. That's what I wanted to use him for. He's not very subtle in the other sense that he wants to. Much better example might be like actually the current Danish Prime Minister, who's a woman but has also taken on this role of the protective patriarch. She gave in her opening speech a almost similar speech where she also painted a picture of a society in decay, and she was going to protect us and restore order. What she's doing is, abolishing certain protections in order to save people, like to protect the children. She wants to make it easier to take children away from their parents. So this is done under a much more subtle, you're abolishing people's rights to care, and be with their families in order to protect the little ones. This much more efficient probably, but that all depends on the various locations that you make the rhetoric in.
Just sort of going off the last couple of questions, I think when we talk about masculinity and climate change, in a lot of countries' context, especially in developing countries, there are very strong patriarchal leaders who kind of push through this idea of masculinity as very closely interconnected with money and power. So when brought up with this idea of climate change, their response has mostly been, it's not real, it's not really happening. Let's focus on what's important, which is making our countries rich. And I just want to know, is that a side of the masculinity and climate change intersection that you've kind of explored? Because I feel like certainly in a lot of our context, that's where we're at right now.
Yeah. That is like masculinity comes in many different forms. And yeah, one of them is certainly, it's not just climate change, it's like many environmental issues have a gendered problem, that it's not masculine to care about the environment, or there's a problem with gender roles in all sorts of environmental ways. So we have both, because I think, like right now, you have the U.S. officially, being one of the leaders in denying climate change, or like saying it's not important. But I think that could change. As I told you, the military is very concerned about it, and if you get to frame climate change as a war, the war on climate, then I could easily see the next American politician winning on being a climate, activist, because it all depends on how you frame it. It being on a war on climate is masculine, you can change gender roles, like the little pieces of Lego. You can put things onto another one. It's a whole field of study. How do we get men to change their attitudes towards, plastic bags and like lots of things? But I think you can. It's just a matter of framing, putting certain things onto the gender roles that they already have, which might be a problem in itself, because maybe you want to change those gender roles in the first place. But it's a long discussion.
Hi, thank you so much for highlighting affect theory and for solidarities and movements of solidarities. I'm wondering if I can encourage you to extend this mapping of gender beyond the patriarchal masculinity protectionism to the solidarity movements that you've pointed out, which are often marked as feminine, nurturing, caring, creating community, and so on. Would you say that if we extended a sort of gender mapping of this area that you've laid out, would you say that that would be degendered, or that it would be feminist?
Well, it would certainly be feminist. And I would not say it would be degendered. I mean, I don't think care, solidarity, community, shouldn't be gendered. But in our current society and the ideologies we are reproducing all the time, they are, gender associated. Because it's absolutely true that when I had to go very quickly in the end, but when I tried to summarize some of the values that we need, care, community, it's reproductive societies also. It's societies that try to be, move in a circle instead of growth. Those are all like words that are associated with feminine values. But I do want to degender those because it's what we all need. But it certainly is a feminist topic, and it's something I would like to explore more.
I think we need to end the discussion here. We're out of time. Thank you very much, Ole, for... And thanks to all of you in the audience for being with us today. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to our next lecture on the 13th of February with Hólmfríður Garðarsdóttir, Professor of Spanish, about women in environmental movements in Latin America. And her lecture will be called Þær leggja líf sitt að veði, kvenleg ásýnd náttúruverndar í Rómönsku Ameríku. And as you heard, the lecture will be in Icelandic. You'll find further information on the program on RIKK's and GEST's websites. And so thank you and have a good afternoon.